take a moment and try to remember the last time you experienced significant disruption in your life. I'm not talking about a minor inconvenience. Significant disruption. There was a plan, things were going according to plan, and then things stopped going according to plan in a really, really, really big way. Could be an unexpected diagnosis. Could be a sudden and unexpected conflict in the context of your family. Could be the loss of a job. Could be bereavement, the grief of a death of someone you care deeply about. Could be unanticipated difficulty with your children, or any number of things. You got it? Now take a moment and try to remember how you responded in that season of disruption. In that time of great disappointment, what was the response or posture of your heart? Perhaps you were tempted to ask some questions. Why, God? Why this? Why now? Why me? Why did you let this happen? Don't you love me? Aren't you good? Don't you know how much I love this person? And now I don't have them anymore? Don't you know what the plan was? And now it's gone? And in those places, we want to be faithful. We want to trust Him. And we know we're supposed to, don't we? But in our heart of hearts, in seasons of major disruption, even if we don't tell our friends, it can be easy to begin to question the goodness of God. You don't expect to get there, do you? None of us ever do. But in seasons of radical disruption, faithful people can find themselves asking questions they never expected to ask. Now, if this sort of situation or experience has not happened to you, just wait. And remember that it has happened to people in the room not that far away from you right now. Remember that it's happened to people in your neighborhoods who live down the street. Remember that it's happened to people in your family. The American church is in a season right now of pretty significant disruption. There's a whole group of people called deconstructors. And these are folks who kind of grew up with a real standard, rosy picture of Christianity, and then things kind of went sideways. And it's not necessarily, it's not even clear whose fault it is sometimes. But in that place where things went in an unexpected direction, there are a lot of people who kind of grew up in church, and they're beginning to ask, what is this even about? And can I trust these people anymore? And can I trust God? And so even if this isn't my experience consistently, though I think most of us, when we're honest, have had these challenging experiences and questions in seasons of disruption, it's very much the reality in which the American church is ministering right now. There are people all over the city who are asking, can I still trust God? And so we're asking the question, that's the question, isn't it? What does it look like when we're disappointed by the church? What does it look like when we're disappointed by the diagnosis? What does it look like when our lives are radically disrupted and we're not sure we can trust anymore and we're not sure who to turn to anymore? What does it look like to be faithful? What does it look like to walk with Jesus in seasons of disruption without having our walk with Him damaged or recede? That is the question that James invites his first century readers to ask. And it is the question he now invites us to ask. We'll dig into it a little more in a minute. But for now, it's pretty self-evident that this is a church James is writing to, several of them apparently, in a season of disruption. Whenever you face trials of any kind, many kinds, that sounds pretty disruptive to me. And in that place, he's inviting them to be faithful. He's inviting them to look to Jesus. He's inviting them to trust the Lord. He's inviting them to be vigilant. And if we were to say, James, how would you guide us in navigating the disruption in our lives? He would say, the same way I want to guide my original audience in navigating the disruption they experience. And it's like this, James would say, to us, seasons of disruption require vigilance against double-mindedness. James is going to talk about what it means to be double-minded, and he's going to talk about how to guard against that, and it's going to be the crucial thing in staying faithful in the midst of disappointment, trial, difficulty, and disruption. Seasons of disruption require vigilance against double-mindedness. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this letter came to be. We get some information up front, which is helpful. We always want more info, but we got to work with what we've got. This is what God in his wisdom has given us. James introduces himself as the author of the letter. Now, here's the challenge. In the first century, in the Jewish world, there were a lot of little boys named James by their parents. It's kind of like the John of our day, right? There are Jameses all over the place. Fortunately for us, there are only a few candidates who would actually have written a document like this. There were a couple of Jameses in the original group of 12 disciples. They're not the most likely candidates. And there's another James, if you read through Acts, that rose to prominence. Another James who convened what we call the Jerusalem Council to discuss what it would look like for non-Jewish believers in Jesus to be a part of this new Jewish messianic movement called the Way of Jesus. And this James turns out to be Jesus' own brother. And so the church throughout history has said our best candidate, the one who kind of lived long enough to write this and the one who had the leadership to write it and have it stick around, is Jesus' own brother, James, one of the leaders of the church as it was making its way forward, rooted in Jerusalem and reaching to the nations. James is our best candidate. So we're going to go with the church's wisdom. James, the brother of Jesus, is the one who writes this letter. And he writes it to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Now, I bet you can figure out at least a little bit of who he's talking about there, because if you've read the Bible much, you know there's a group with 12 tribes, particularly one nation in particular, one people group, and who would they be? It's the Hebrew people, right? You read through the Old Testament, 12 tribes. So he's talking to people of Hebrew descent, and he says they're in the dispersion. And dispersion is a word that means what? It just means they're scattered out. And in the first century, in this time period, there were Jewish people, some of them were followers of Jesus and others were not, who lived outside the Holy Land, outside Jerusalem and Judea and that area, and they were called the dispersion. And so James is writing as a leader, a pillar of the church, to Jewish followers of Jesus who live outside the Holy Land. That's the context of this letter. And we're told immediately, aren't we, that they're facing a season of disruption. And now that we know they're Jewish believers living outside the Holy Land, we're not surprised that they're facing a season of disruption. Because if you know anything about the first century in the Roman Empire, then you probably have heard that it's not easy to be Jewish in Roman lands. We hear a lot about anti-Semitism today, this disregard or prejudice against Jewish people. It's not a new thing. It was very prominent in the ancient world. And so Jewish people and people of other ethnicities were constantly at it with one another. There's a lot of conflict. They would have kind of derogatory slurs that they would throw at each other. And it was frequent, particularly outside the Holy Land, for Jewish people to experience, not necessarily related to Christianity, just related to their ethnicity, to experience unkindness or even opposition or outright persecution. So James is writing to them in this time of instability, this time of disruption. And he wants to invite them to be faithful, and he wants to cultivate faithfulness among them. He wants to help them guard against the things that would take their hearts and souls and minds away from Jesus and to other things. He wants to help them be vigilant, to guard against double-mindedness. And so he's writing to them to help them do that, to help them be faithful. Looks like they've got some ethical issues that need to be sorted out. And it looks like they've got to be firm against opposition from the outside. And you know as well as I do that when you're getting pressure from the outside, those internal issues can get amplified really quickly. When you're getting treated badly from people on the outside, the conflict on the inside can get worse quickly. James wants to help his initial readers avoid an exasperated internal conflict, to help them remain faithful to Jesus and faithful to each other. And to do that, he offers them a big contrast between faithfulness on the one side and double-mindedness on the other. So you can either be faithful, James says, or you can be what he calls double-minded. Doubting is the way he talks. Unstable. My mind, if I'm faithful, is singularly focused on Jesus. And if I'm double-minded, it means he doesn't have my whole heart. It means I'm giving something of my heart, my mind, my soul to some other God, some other Lord. I don't call it that, but I'm distracted. I'm offering myself somewhere else. And so he gives us in these first few verses, chapter 1, verses 2, 3, and 4, this word picture of what it means to be faithful. He says, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, and they're facing those, consider it nothing but joy. And you think that's counterintuitive, isn't it? I mean, it's not, honestly, we don't really counsel people that way, do we? Somebody's having a rough go. We don't usually say, consider it pure joy. They're going to go find some other friends, aren't they? Somebody who'll maybe put an arm on their shoulder and be a little softer, perhaps. But that's what he says. It's counterintuitive, but he's in the midst of trials, difficulties, disruptions, opposition. Consider it joy. Fill in the picture, please, James. Help us understand this. What are you talking about? Why, in the midst of the most painful situation in my life, should I be joyful? He says, I'll go on. Here's why. Because you know, verse 3, the testing of your faith produces endurance. For James, there's an outcome beyond the difficulty. And the outcome beyond the difficulty makes the season of disruption endurable, manageable, and in many ways, in God's providence, formative. Now, let's put the spiritual stuff on the shelf for just a second and talk about the rest of our lives and the relationship between trial and endurance. Let's talk about high school sports. I played a little football in high school. Wasn't very good at it, but I did it. And what I found was that the coaches wanted us to develop endurance. Guess how they did that? They put us through what you could call a series of trials and tryouts and weight regimens and conditioning programs. You couldn't put on shoulder pads and helmets until a certain date in August, but you could run all week in February, all month. And you could run in the morning, and you could run after school, and you could just keep on doing that the entire off season. And we did. And what we found was when the season came along and we got to the fourth quarter and we might have been behind a little bit, that the other team was often out of breath with hands on hips, not running quite as fast as they did at the beginning of the game. But we've been running since February. And our guys might have been a little smaller, but they could still breathe. And because they had endured, because we had endured the challenge of off-season conditioning, we were able to win a lot of games at the end in the fourth quarter because we had more endurance than our opponents. So we get this, don't we? We know there's a relationship between difficulty and endurance, challenges and lasting, right? We talk about this in the workplace, right? You kind of get to a new place and a new job. What do you got to do? You got to pay your dues, don't you? And that means it's not going to be easy. You got to learn the ropes. You're going to have some challenges. You got to learn the personalities. You got to figure out who the influencers are. You got to deal with the grunt work that comes with being the new person in a job. But if you make it through those trials, that extra difficulty, without abandoning the post, there's a good chance that you'll achieve your professional goals. See how that works? Trials, difficulty, cultivating endurance with a prize at the end. And so James is just inviting us to take something we know that's true about the rest of our lives that we take for granted and think about discipleship in the same patterns. Everything is like this. Everything is like this. I'm willing to go through the pain of 2-a-day practices in 129-degree heat because there's an opportunity to win a state title. James says, in this season of disruption, in this time of despair and trial and challenge and opposition and conflict, in this season of disruption, Jesus is training you. He's teaching you endurance, and that's the fruit, that's the result. So yeah, maybe the church has let us down. Honestly, you don't have to go to church long to get let down. Can we just be honest about that? I've been doing church stuff a long time. People get let down all the time. Amen? No amens. Everyone's completely content. We know it's true. We get disappointed. If we stay the course, by the grace of God and the power of the Spirit who lives within us, Jesus is cultivating something, isn't he? He's cultivating something. He's cultivating endurance. He's helping us grow stronger. He's reproducing himself, his character, his life, his power, his strength. But if we step away from those seasons and just say, I'm done, forget it, then we're saying to him, I'm done, forget it. And it's very hard for him to reproduce his strengths when we walk away from him or when we say, no, I can do this myself. Because very rarely do we actually just say, I'm done with you, Jesus. What we tend to do is say, I got this myself. Two sides of the same coin, perhaps? So James wants to invite endurance. He wants to see endurance get formed in the faithful. And faithfulness, this ongoing thing, cultivates endurance. So yes, life is difficult. Yes, we go through seasons of radical disappointment and disruption. Yes, but that does not mean God is not good. And it does not mean he's not faithful, and it does not mean he's not at work. James would say that's exactly when he's at work. Because it's only in those seasons where we actually learn what it looks like to trust his work without trying to run to show ourselves. So James says, let him work. Let him cultivate endurance. Consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect. So there's more. Like, endurance isn't the end in itself. There's more. It'll have its effect. What's the effect? So that you may be mature and complete. So that you can flourish. You're saying, James, that when life gets disappointing, or when I'm disrupted, and we're, again, not like minor inconveniences, major disruptions. You're saying, if I lean into the Lord, then he's going to make me whole, complete, lacking nothing. And if I lean out, if I lean back, I'm going to miss the work that he wants to do. And James is saying, that's exactly what I mean. That's exactly what I mean. You lean into him in those seasons of radical disruption, because that's the place where he works. That's the place where he shows his sufficiency. That's the place where he's able to show his perfect love, because it's not conditioned on my context or situation. But if I lean out and say, no, I got control, I'm going to do this myself, I can handle it. It's hard, but I'm tough. Then I'm stepping out of the space where he works. And James says, lean into that. It produces stability. It produces wholeness. It produces Christian maturity, Christian proficiency. And the goal here is stability, flourishing, drawing near to the one who can meet my needs in the season of radical disruption. In contrast, James tells us about the double-minded. And if the faithful are stable, the double-minded are like waves blown around by the wind in a storm. Chances are some of us have been on the Gulf Coast when a storm comes in. Kind of hear the wind coming. And before long, the wind's whipping the waves. And things are getting kind of scary and dangerous. And maybe you see a boat out on the water and you're like, I'm glad I'm not on that boat right now, because those swells, it's getting rough and it's getting bad. And James says, if you lean out of Jesus in those seasons of disruption, radical disruption, you're going to look a lot like the chaos of the waters in the middle of the storm. Like, things are going to get knocked around, and it's not going to be good for you. You may feel like you're in control. You're on that boat. The storm's coming in. You've got the wheel. But the Lord is the one who will keep you afloat. James says, here it is, one of two options. In those seasons of disruption, will we be tossed around and unstable, unmoored from the perfect love of Jesus? Will we lean into him? Lean into his perfect love. Saying, Lord, I don't understand. I don't get it. I'm afraid. I'm hurt. I'm angry. But I trust you. I trust you. I trust your goodness. I trust you. So James says, here's the options, one or the other. You're going to lean into this instability, or you're going to lean into this wholeness. I think we want to lean into wholeness, don't we? All right, let's try it. I think we want to lean into wholeness, don't we? All right, that's good. I thought so. I just want to make sure. It's a holiday weekend. So what does that look like? How do we cultivate that kind of vigilance that keeps us in that place of wholeness where Jesus can work? And James has got some help for us in that. I wrote down 4 instruments or practices for cultivating vigilance. There's probably more, but it's a communion Sunday. So we'll just stick with these. And the first is this: if we want to cultivate vigilance, we have to cultivate a Jesus-focused identity. Now, James doesn't say this as much as he embodies it. And here's what I mean. Chapter 1, verse 1. James, a servant of God. Some translations render it slave. That's probably a better translation. James, slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Now remember what we said. This is Jesus' brother. And that means that he wasn't always the biggest fan of Jesus. If you read through the Gospels, you discover that Jesus' family was rather a bit antagonistic to him. In the early chapters of the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is doing his ministry, and somebody comes along and says, hey, your mother and your brothers, your family's here. Would you come out? They want you to come outside. They didn't want him to come outside because they were really happy with what he was up to. It's like, Jesus, your brothers are here. Come outside. It's not pleasant. Like, they want him to stop. He's bringing all this unwanted attention to their family. He's embarrassing them. Crowds are showing up. Opposition is beginning to form. In the Gospel of John, chapter 7, we are straight up told his brothers did not believe in him. Let that sink in. Family, like they're family. They're in the home together. And James did not believe in him. He doesn't have a Jesus-oriented identity at that point in his life, does he? He's got a Jesus-frustrated identity maybe, but not a Jesus-oriented identity. And so imagine what it must have been like for him, the angst, because you love your brother, but you can get frustrated at people you love, right? And then it all comes to a head, and your brother winds up on a cross. And crosses are shameful in the ancient world, deeply, like forget the pain, everybody else shares in the shame of the crucified. And you can imagine his family grieving the loss and experiencing anger, like, see what he did? We told him to stop it. We told him to just take it down and stop doing all this. And now he's been crucified like a rebel, and all of our names have been dragged through the mud. You can imagine what the grief and the anger and the hurt and the frustration James must have experienced on that first Good Friday. And then you can imagine the reorientation of his identity when he saw his brother raised from the dead. Son of God in power. Imagine the shift there. Imagine the sorrow, imagine the humility, imagine the contrition, imagine the movement from I wish you would stop it to I am your servant, your slave. You know, if Jesus was my brother and I was writing a letter, I'd probably be like, brother of Jesus. Like, we like to drop names, don't we? Like, drop the name. Like, this is the name above all names. Drop it already, right? Like, there's credibility there if you grew up with him and you're a pillar of the church in Acts. But he doesn't play his, he doesn't appeal to his family relationship. He doesn't throw out his James pillar of the church credentials. He doesn't define his identity in relation to anything except whom? The God who revealed himself in Jesus. That's a Jesus-oriented identity. Right? He doesn't define himself in any way in this letter except in relation to Jesus and the God Jesus reveals. There's a shift there. And I think James is embodying this thing that we need to embrace. Like, what does it look like for me to not lean into my credentials or my reputation or my family name or whatever? Just Jesus. Just Jesus. Who defines me? Jesus. Who deploys me? Jesus. Who has rescued me? Jesus. Can I add anything to that? No way. So James is inviting us to be people who are singularly defined by the Lord. And here's the thing, friends. If you are singularly defined by the Lord, singly focused on Him, you will not be double-minded. You're not going to be spread out in every different direction. If you're singularly oriented around Jesus, if He defines your identity, your mind, your heart, your soul are not going to be spread out all over the place, getting knocked around. So James offers that up. How do you cultivate vigilance against double-mindedness? Single focus on Jesus. Draw your identity from Him. How else? Second thing, James would say, trust the character of God. Trust the character of God in a time of many trials. Verse 5, if any of you is lacking wisdom, ask God. And why ask God? Because His character is marked by generosity. If you're lacking, ask God. If you're in this place of hardship, if you're in this place of disruption, you don't know what to do, you lack wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly. I wonder sometimes if we think of God in these terms as part of our regular rhythms. He loves us, we know that. And He's kind to us a lot. But what if we think of God as ungrudgingly? Like, that's colorful. We know what grudges look like, don't we? Yeah, I'll do it for you, but you owe me. He's not like that, is He? He gives to all generously. And this is one of the ways that the cross is described in the letters of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. The death of Jesus is called this generous act. And we find that there's this, in the gospel, in God's ultimate revelation of His character, with arms spread, thorns on His face, hands pierced, feet pierced, spear in His side, the scriptures say, look at His generosity. Look how kind He is. Like the man on the cross is not saying, you owe me. He's saying, I've got everything I am is spent for you. Everything. And James would say, that's who He is. And yes, life is disrupted. But certainly the cross is a disruption. Certainly the cross is a disruption. Certainly the suffering and the pain and the radical disappointment that everyone felt. And nevertheless, God was at work, wasn't He? Counterintuitively, surprisingly, and beautifully to save us, to redeem us. His character is generous. He's not holding stuff back from His beloved children. He's not saying, I'll give you a little bit now, but can't do too much because then you'll get spoiled. He doesn't begrudge us. James says, in that season of great disruption, trust His character. When Jesus experienced disruption, His character came through. And we can trust the one whose arms were stretched and whose blood was shed, whose life was sacrificed for us. He's trustworthy. Even when it feels like I'm drowning, He's good. James says, lean into that. Lean into that. Trust the character of God. So Jesus-focused identity. Trust the character of God. James would also tell us, you got to understand the nature of faith. We're talking a lot about faith, and we're talking a lot about faithfulness. And those are words in the 21st century that get thrown around a lot. You'll go into the political realm and hear people talking about faith, and you'll go into pop culture realm and people talk about trust. All those kinds of things, or they'll talk about faith, and it doesn't always mean what the Bible's talking about. So what are we talking about in the scriptures? When you're in a season of desperation, what does it mean to trust, to have faith in Jesus. It doesn't mean you need to get more faith so God will do more stuff for you. I read an article this week that said like 3 out of 4 American Christians have at least a bit of appreciation or belief in what's called the prosperity gospel. If you know what that is, it's the belief that if I trust God a lot, he'll give me all the stuff I want. You're familiar with that. Turn on the TV one afternoon or one evening. I think these guys are still on TV. I haven't watched them in a long time myself. Like if you're suffering, it's because you don't trust enough. You don't have enough faith. If you get more faith, what happens? Your life will get better, you'll get a raise, and all the material blessings you've wanted, like God will just give them to you. And that kind of treats faith like you can keep it in a bucket. Like I got a bucket, and it's only halfway full of faith, and if I can get some more faith in there, fill up my bucket, God will do some stuff for me. What a disaster. Like talk about not what the Bible means when it talks about faith in God. Like faith isn't, hey God, I'm going to do this for you so you'll do something for me. Faith is trust that you'll do what I can't do. Like I've got all my resources. I've got all my resources, all my strength, and I've found it's worthless here. It didn't keep my loved one from dying. It didn't keep me from getting that diagnosis. It didn't keep my church from not voting to disaffiliate. My life is disrupted, and I can't fix it. Faith is saying, Jesus, in this moment when I have nothing, I trust you to do what I can't do. I can't save myself. I can't forgive my sins. I can't sanctify myself. I can't change my heart. Only you can do that. Only you, Jesus. So I'm going to trust you to do what I can't do for myself. That's what we mean when we talk about faith. This loyalty, this trust that affirms the perfect sufficiency of Jesus to meet the needs I cannot meet. Like, get all the faith you want. Fill up your bucket. You will not get it done with that. Faith is saying, Jesus, my bucket is empty. Can you please help me? Help me. And James wants people who are suffering to look to the Lord for help. I don't have what it takes. Disruptions happen. Let's just be honest. Disruptions happen. They will happen. The question is, how do we respond? Do I lean into trusting him, or do I step back and try to manage it myself? Jesus-focused identity. Trust the character of God. Understand that faith is about trust, not producing something. And then cultivate humility. You may have noticed the language of lowliness at the end of the passage we read together. May have been disturbed by it, honestly, because many of us are quite rich compared to James in his original context and the people to whom he was writing. Let the believer who is lowly, verse 9, boast in being raised up. So like the humble, the poor, boast in the God who can raise you up when you don't have the resources to do it yourself. And the rich, I think he's got in mind people who tend to go, I can take care of this. I got what it takes. Look at my resources. Boast in being brought low. Boast in cultivating humility. Not thinking more highly of myself than I ought. Not looking to myself at all, but looking to Jesus and my neighbor. And here's the thing. In this place of radical disruption, like double-mindedness looks like, what am I going to do? I'll try this, I'll try that, I'll try this. All these, maybe I'm triply minded or quadruply minded. Like we're just frantically trying all the options. That's double-mindedness. That's a divided heart. That's doubting the sufficiency and beauty of Jesus. But on the other hand, if I'm cultivating humility, if I'm looking to the needs of others, then whose needs am I not looking to? Mine. Like I'm sliding away from that. I'll try whatever I can to, in this season, how can Jesus use my season of disruption to minister? How can he use it to draw me closer to him? How can he use it to encourage the church? Cultivating humility is the practice of embodying the character of Jesus, who looked not to his own interests, but humbled himself. Like when we cultivate that by the strength of his Spirit, acknowledging we don't have what it takes, he begins to reproduce his character in us. And if we never go through that season of radical disruption, it's very hard to get to that place. The result is joy, stability, wholeness. Don't you want to be whole? You want to be tossed around, knocked around, thrown about, unstable? Because stuff's going to come, isn't it? And when it comes, do you want to be stable or knocked out, knocked around? The path to stability, to Christian maturity, to wholeness, the path to joy takes vigilance against this doubting double-mindedness. It doesn't mean can't ask questions. I love questions. If we spend any time together, you've probably learned I love questions. I'll ask you questions, you can ask me questions. Like you can ask questions. And if the answers aren't immediately obvious, that's okay. That's not the kind of doubt James is talking about here. He's talking about a thing where our hearts are divided against the Lord. And if you got questions about who God is and what he's like, there are people in this room who would love to walk that path with you. I would love to walk that path with you so that it never becomes double-minded instability, but wholeness, completeness. Jesus ministering to us and us experiencing the beauty of his care and his perfect love. Hear this, brothers and sisters. God is not insensitive to the disruptions that shake up our lives. God is not insensitive to the disruptions in our lives. He longs in those seasons to draw us near. Don't hold him away. Surrender. And he will fill you with his comfort, his grace, and his joy.